about to begin speaking. Cool. Then without further ado, I'd like to invite the Leader of Opposition to continue.
Okay, for POIs, please offer them in the chat. I'm going to be talking about 4 things in the speech. Firstly, like even if this is theoretically beneficial, it leads to major rights violations. Secondly, why a concentration of power in a single city is necessary for degrees of economic growth. Thirdly, why economic growth matters and trickles down. And then finally, what rural areas would look like on the comparative. Into massive rights violations. I think that the problem with OG is that they're quite vague in terms of the precise mechanism over how this is going to happen. Given that this is not a policy motion, they need to engage with ways that states have tried to restrict migration when this policy has been implemented under the status quo. I think they've broadly done 2 things. So firstly, in circumstances where cities are already really large and governments then try and downsize them, which they have to do under this motion, you literally end up getting direct evictions when people are living within these cities. So you go into people's homes, you often burn down property, you force people out of areas with guns, which literally happened in Rio. But secondly, when you get quota-based systems that exist, this is still imposing a limitation on an individual's capacity to move, often along economic lines. You allow more privileged people to be the ones who are going into these cities. And it's often regulated by politicians who often have harmful incentives. So they might be a member of an ethnic group and therefore have like restriction migration policies, which has been a problem with the hookah system overall. Note that these are inherently massive rights violations. So I think that the right not to be evicted is key to bodily security, as there's often a threat of violence, and the right to move is key to any conception of bodily autonomy that exists. I think that then, even if a gov team can prove that this is better for society overall, these rights violations are not justified because it involves a high degree of instrumentalization of the individual. I think that people have self-ownership of themselves by virtue of the fact that they are forced to interact with their bodies on an incredibly proximate basis, and therefore our bodies and our labor are effectively our own. Even if the state theoretically has obligations to promote a wide degree of economic growth, I don't think it's justified to restrict an individual's right and capacity to move to facilitate those obligations. In the same way, we would think it's incredibly unjust to force the smartest people within a country to work 24 hours a day at the behest of the state because they have not consented to be born into that state or consented into obligations they might have to other individuals. Second main contribution, why is a concentration of power in a single city necessary for growth? So our claim is effectively that overpopulation is actually a beneficial vehicle for degrees of economic growth that exist, which is why most developing countries have followed the recent development trajectory of having megacities form like Kuala Lumpur, like Kigali, then become vehicles for the remainder of the country to experience a higher degree of economic growth. The first reason why this is beneficial for that is that lower wages that end up recurring help businesses compete within international markets. Having a surplus of labor admittedly does decrease the bargaining power of individual workers, but we see that this is ultimately a good thing because what this means is that businesses that end up saving money on labor better allowing them to compete within international markets overall. Secondly, there are huge benefits of agglomeration that exist, which refer to the practice of having many businesses being concentrated within a single area. The first reason for this is that businesses that are concentrated near one another makes importing and exporting between businesses substantially cheaper. This is very important in a developing world context where a lot of companies are still manufacturing based, meaning that there's often things like supply transfers of car parts between different companies and companies that end up saving massive amounts of money on that. But secondly, it also provides an incentive for better practices by companies because you end up getting more competition. So in a situation where you have like 20 businesses that a worker is able to choose from, you actually incentivize these companies to be better when there's an easier transfer of labor that is ultimately going to exist. I think that the third thing to say here is that this is often needed in order to get forms of FDI. There's multiple reasons for this. So the lower wages that I described, a guaranteed large pool of people who are always going to work for a company, even if there is competition in the central business district. I think a really important factor here is also just having the reputation of being a central business district when your country is generally seen as being financially irresponsible. So within Western media, cities like Lagos and Kigali are referred to as being the central business districts of African countries. But I think it's important overcoming a lot of investment stigma when countries are otherwise perceived as being politically volatile. I also think that political power that is concentrated guarantees favorable business regulations that might otherwise face degrees of rural resistance at the false kind of perceived notion that this might disadvantage rural areas. So things like lowering taxation and creating other like zoning policies in order to attract a very wide degree of FDI that exists. Note, FDI is often needed because domestic corporations, due to like colonialism, often lack certain know-how, meaning that things like foreign technology is really important. important. And even if like foreign companies do bad things, I think that it's choice maximizing, because having a shit $5 an hour wage is probably better than the comparative having no wage whatsoever. Next then, why does economic growth actually matter, and what are the tangible trickle-down benefits of this? So firstly, when you have individual cities who are flourishing more, you often get outward forms of like population around the peripheries of cities. So you kind of get new cities forming along megacities, which is uniquely facilitated when you have things like railways and export hubs that are established in these cities themselves. And that even if there is overpopulation, there is a like solving mechanism here when it comes to things like trickle-down growth. But secondly, more money ends up going to the government when GDP growth is higher, and you're getting more tax revenue from these cities overall. Meaning that governments are less likely to do things like be trapped in debt cycles, paying off interest rates. It improves credit ratings when governments have less debt. But more importantly, governments have a higher capacity to invest in the people overall. I think the response is like, what is the incentive to when political power is concentrated, which is what opening government says. Firstly, investing more in urban services is still a net win. I think it's good if millions of people in urban areas have better water supplies. Secondly, it's not like rural states have like zero political power just because there's urban gridlock. I think that there can often be coalitions between rural states if there are more homogenous interests, which is why a lot of states have some degree of like equalization payments exist, where you do not want to completely neglect rural areas that exist. Thirdly, though, I think that like there's often connectedness between services in urban and rural areas. So if there are systematic power outages, this is often a problem with the entire electricity grid. So targeting this for urban areas often then trickles down into rural areas. Before I continue, I'll take a POI from back half.
Yeah, when Nike gets more profits from their businesses, that doesn't trickle down to the people on the ground, but rather just goes back to the CEO's pocket. All you prove in your best case,
yeah, but I've literally
that
explained why you can tax these companies, which then means that the state ends up getting more money overall. And if Nike does really well, that means that more people within these countries get employed. And that is an active benefit overall. Okay, the final thing that I want to talk about then is what is the comparative for these rural areas? So the reason why people are leaving rural areas, despite the fact that they often have family, friends, community there, is that there just are not jobs under the status quo, and that there are often urban areas that just have better underlying economic conditions. Firstly, there's often just not enough people, or more importantly, like human capital shortages, where education systems are often worse in quality. Secondly, there are often things like territorial barriers, so like rougher climates, bad terrain to set up mass factories, a lack of like a lack of proximity to things like export sectors that exist. But this means that there's often no investment in rural areas under either side of a house, where countries either stay in the West or continue to go to large cities. This is also why political capture in this debate is somewhat symmetric, because larger cities are still going to have wealthier urban elites who are going to have the most political sway under either side of a house, regardless of the scale of that influence. I would posit that we are actually better for rural areas, where firstly, having people leave actually maximizes employment opportunities in lower skilled jobs. So things like working as a janitor in a mom and pop shop actually becomes more available when you have more people going to cities. Secondly, remittance payments. This is really important. You have like a dad who goes to the city, makes a lot of money, comes home for certain seasons, and at the very least, especially with mobile technology, sends some of that money back home. For all of these reasons, I'm very proud to stand in opening opposition.
I'd like to thank the Leader of Opposition for that speech and invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue.
Mauro?
It's a bit faint.
Okay. Is that better now?
Yeah, that's fine.
Three, two, one. The first thing they say about our case is that it's vague, and they try to strawman it by saying that we're going to force people out of city. Obviously, around the world, there's abundance of examples, which Ed told you very clearly about how we can use positive incentive to try and get people to move into rural areas. That looks like the fact that we're like African countries are constantly setting up special economic zones in rural areas, where Chinese companies in particular now have an incentive to concentrate their foreign direct investment in those areas. It looks like, for example, many countries making visa contingent on people getting visas contingent on them moving into rural countries, etc. No, that means our mechanisms are not vague, but also it means it knocks out a lot of their stuff about the principle consideration, the idea that we're instrumentalizing people to get a greater aim. I would say, firstly, obviously, when they try to strawman our case and say that we're forcing people out, firstly, we don't have to stand for that. But secondly, I think that's just very unlikely insofar as most cases, if you're forcing people out of your home, you're probably going to create mass political instability that could potentially undermine your government. So I think in the only instances where that might actually happen are in extreme edge cases where there's already a lot of political instability, and therefore the government feels because one sectarian part of the country supports them and hate one other group, then therefore they feel like they can do it and stay in power. But obviously, most of this debate is going to take place with using positive incentives. And in terms of their principle, right? So given that we're now using positive incentives, right, what they have to grapple with is in their world, that people are literally coerced by the fact that they're starved in rural areas and have to move to these cities, right? They're literally instrumentalized to have all these benefits for the city and for people who live in cities, as opposed to like having the option to live in a city or to live in a rural area, right? So principally, if you care about people's agency and you care about people's right to choose, maybe it has nothing to do with economics. Maybe they want to live in a rural area because they just like the social connection, or maybe they want to live in New York because they have, social roots, etc. At least in our world, they have both options. Because New York is still going to have a lot of businesses, still going to have a lot of jobs, but at least now if they do want to live in a rural area, and now businesses want to take advantage of cheaper land in rural areas, etc., they have incentives that make it profitable. And to preempt like the stuff coming out from clothing said, why would they do this, right? The whole reason why they don't do it now, and they might do it in the future, is now they're going to be fine. Like it's going to be like when you factor in the cost benefit analysis of building a supply line or building a factory in a rural area, you can actually predict the fact that, hey, people are probably going to start moving into this area. Population is probably going to grow to a sufficient extent. I'm probably going to be able to take advantage of tax laws, etc., right? And suddenly, in a lot of cases, the calculus changes so that now it can be profitable for you to invest in these things in the long term. What's the second thing they say? They say it's essential to growth. Firstly, they say it's essential to growth because it makes cheaper, import cheaper, because now you can have supply chains that service a lot of businesses. Maybe in some instances that's true, but I'm going to talk about how in the future, right, that gets undermined if you have the problems of overpopulation and etc. But just know, right, when you have overpopulation, you also have constraint on those supply chains. That is to say, when you have extreme traffic, or when you have highly concentrated areas, for example, in places like India or Asia, right, where literally you can't build new infrastructure to accommodate new supply chain without force evicting hundreds of thousands of people who have nowhere to go, right? Obviously, in those instances, your capacity to expand supply chain get severely mitigated on their side of the house. Secondly, they say it's easy to call for foreign direct investment because now businesses can they're all together and they can lobby governments, etc. Right? I would say that is literally that's literally a harm on their side, right? Because on their side, maybe a small section do get that foreign direct investment. One of the big harms that we brought to you in EdSpeed was literally that, now people in rural areas who may not want to move because of social connection, or who may not have the financial resources to move, constantly get starved of these resources and therefore have to suffer those harms. Additionally, that also leads into our political instability, insofar as they're going to resent the people who live in those areas. They're going to resent the politicians who, even if the democratic system is perfect, right, are probably going to be swayed by the concentrated lobbying of businesses who all exist in one area and therefore get more infrastructure for that area, right? But just note, right, maybe they might get some development for people in the right now and get a quicker development in the future right now. But there's a couple of reasons why it is far more important to prioritize future sustainable development, i.e. ensuring that in the future we can prevent things like overpopulation, etc. In the future, we can prevent things like political instability. And these are a couple of reasons why that's far more important, right? So firstly, obviously in our world, if governments are investing in these areas, they're giving tax incentives for people to invest in these areas, etc. Right? It's unclear why you're going to have less investment or not. I would say if you have to build more train lines, etc., in order to fund more businesses that are further from each other, and then you're probably just going to have more jobs in those instances. But additionally, right, when you get to that critical threshold where suddenly you're oh fucking shit, suddenly we have all these people in an area that we didn't properly plan for, right? Those people obviously suffer, and those people probably care. We should care about them more in the future than we should about people now, because there's going to be far more people in the future, and those people can consent less to those changes, etc. That doomed them to this, the pain that we brought up in EdSpeed. I'll take a POI from CEO.
So if you assert that you're more likely to use positive incentives, my question is, how do you get those financial resources in developing countries, for example, where the government probably does not have enough money to institute things like infrastructure everywhere around the world?
Yeah, so obviously there's a whole host of reasons why you invest in developing countries, right? Developing countries have the cheapest land. that have the cheapest labor. So when you're a multinational industry, you're not going to set a factory up in America or New York. You're going to want to set a factory up in Nigeria, etc., right? And obviously Nigeria, in our world, we would say should prioritize places outside of their main city, because whilst it might like get some quicker advancement right now, at least they don't have to deal with the overpopulation effect that countries like India are facing right now, which means they can have the security of knowing that their growth is sustainable. Cool. So the reason why I think I'll cover all that. So anyway, so the reason why we win this debate, sure, they might get some development in the short term, etc., but we've proven that development can be unsustainable. These governments tend to be woefully bad at planning in the long term, because political cycles tend to be like very short and very like short-sighted, etc., right? So yes, they might get some development in the future now, but necessarily if they continue to allow like the natural evolution of some cities growing exponentially faster than rural cities, they're necessarily setting themselves up for failure of overpopulation, of political instability, the fallout and environmental impact that Ed tells you. And obviously that hurts more people in the future since population is growing in general. And that's why we take the debate.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech and invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to close the top half of this debate. Hear, hear.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. I'm just going to start by engaging on Prop's best case, positive financial incentives for development that are run by a government with fairly good economic incentives. Greece has spent years and almost $1 trillion of IMF money trying to diversify its economy and political power outside of Athens. But the hard laws of geography are incredibly, incredibly hard to fight for all the reasons that Prop observes about path dependency and feedback loops just leading to agglomeration in the first place. That meant two things about their model. Number one, if they wanted to prevent the development of these cities, the cost would be hugely expensive in the moments when states do need to spend that money on development and actual investment. You'd be subsidizing businesses to compete and running economically inefficient supply chains that would not have naturally developed. The second implication, this means that oftentimes their policy will not work until these cities end up agglomerating already, meaning that their policy must necessarily stand for very hard incentives, even if they're positive incentives for people to move, like heavy taxation of people that in essence just amounts to the same coercion that Naomi illustrated. But finally, governments in the real world are likely to use hard measures to implement these policies. Why? Because this is a super convenient excuse to root out the other side voters from urban areas, gerrymander districts in ways that you want, or to push out members of ethnic groups whom you dislike. Prop gave no reason as to why states that are cash-strapped would have the money to do this in positive ways. And we already explained that states that do have the ability to do these policies in the most effective, IMF-approved way almost always fail at the expense of development. First theme, why is it that the political concentration of interest means that we can still get spillover benefits into rural areas? The key claim of Prop here is that the concentration of power into urban areas means that service delivery ends up happening into those areas. I guess my first observation is just, these are the same people who are moving regardless. That is to say, more people are becoming voters with urban interests in this world. Prop does not explain why we should privilege the interests of rural voters any more than urban voters. And we note that even many systems that have huge systems of control by urban areas, like London and the UK, have incredibly, if you look at the way that their political geography is structured, disproportionate electoral power given to rural areas as a counterbalancing effect. Moreover, almost every federal regime has significant equalization payments. All of this is to say that even when you have aggressive agglomeration, that there are always large political incentives to redistribute. Why? Because providing welfare to rural areas is good for their economic development, which is in turn good for cities. It means that you can run your manufacturing and supply chains more effectively through those areas. But last of all, there's just a general trend towards urbanization in the world. The implication of this is quite important because it means that most cities have the majority of people living in urban areas, even if the largest city occupies the majority of those urban areas. It means that the urban area, the largest urban area, is a good proxy for the interests of people living in smaller regional cities as well. The implication of all this is that it is not clear that a significant amount of voters are being disadvantaged. And the alternative measures on Prop are things like giving quotas to rural areas, which will likely entrench the power of like regional economic elites. For example, in most cases, this would probably amount to setting up like special economic zones or hubs in certain regional areas to encourage development. Likely you give those to areas that are politically favorable to the power, to the party in power. It is not clear that this will be done in an economically effective way. The second claim from OG, and by proxy from CG, is that FDI does not work at producing economic development because of this very simplistic argument that money from FDI just goes into the hands of some greedy CEO. Like, I'm not about here to defend Nike using child labor, but I think that the key point is that FDI has been the most important mechanism for economic development in almost every single developing country. For example, FDI is often responsible for over 38% of net GDP in these countries, meaning that this is a literal difference between millions of people having employment versus not. Why is it important to have centralization to lead to FDI? I think that prop makes a misunderstanding of our claim. It's not that presently manufacturing is happening in Bangkok and Kuala Lumpur and it's being moved out now. All the manufacturing was already happening in rural areas where the cost of doing this business was lower. Some of it happens on the outskirts and suburbs of these cities. But the benefit of having agglomeration of economic power is that all your railways are central. All of your financial services are central. There's no duplication in the economy that creates inefficiencies, and it makes it far more easier to have economic development when investors, A, have a credible trust that there's a pro-business environment that's created, as in rural interests, like literal rent-seeking industries that want to compete and put tariffs on foreign competition, which is terrible for the poor people in these countries, but good for their rent-seeking incentives, get political power under prop. But in our world, urban areas which have strong incentives for liberalization, given that they have a pro-business environment, are able to put in policies that are genuinely good for economic development that trickles down to workers. Why does this development trickle down? Number of reasons to prove this, and after this, I'll take a POI from CG. The most basic reason is that when you set up supply chains that are more aggressive, more jobs are created. This means that in urban areas, you end up getting a centralization of business and of services that in turn produces opportunities to build economies of scale that mean that you create more jobs in rural areas as a consequence of the fact that you're now like a national level exporter or a national level service provider, and you need to set up your businesses all across the country. But second of all, when there are benefits to FDI, it means that there are some industries that simply would not have ended up existing domestically without FDI that can come to exist, like higher technology industries that are key to economic diversification, or more competition that means that higher wages are produced. For example, FDI empirically has way higher wages than do domestic providers as a result of the fact that MNCs are oftentimes the most productive firms. The implication of all this is simply that economic development is far stronger in our world. The attempts to basically diversify that into having more urban hubs is just more likely to create inefficiencies that reduce incentives for investment and make it harder for domestic companies to compete as well, given that they have larger costs of serving a more diversified, spread out population that would not have otherwise wanted to spread out in that way. On political power, I think the key link on this, on prop, is that businesses lobby for more urban development, so you get service burdens that are ignored in rural areas. POI from CG.
This debate was never about rural versus urban areas. It was about reinvestment into mid-sized cities that often exist in developing economies. You guys never engage with the actual comparative and prop.
No, I just did. I gave 3 reasons. You have duplication of financial and economic services in regional cities. Political elites end up substantially benefiting. Rent-seeking industries in those areas benefit from redistributive policies like money and subsidies going to those businesses. Obviously, it's not rural-urban. I responded to OG and I explained that basically the trade-off is not between workers working in urban versus rural areas, but is rather whether or not you have large centralization in one large city compared to that comparative. So we've already engaged on that. Finally, I just want to note that the political competition in urban areas is far stronger, which defeats the OG claim that you have businesses doing strong lobbying. Key link here. The ANC is oftentimes in South Africa doing its most political competition in cities. Why? Because rural and regional areas, even smaller cities, have more fixed political interests as a result of their reliance on one particular manufacturing sector or one specialized part of the economy. But interests are far more diverse in urban areas, meaning that they're more politically competitive. You have a stronger impetus for democratization in those regions. Ultimately, opening government never proved that they could solve for the forces of political geography that mean that you do get this centralization. It would be incredibly expensive to do, incredibly detrimental to the rights of people, but moreover, incredibly economically harmful. And for those reasons, we oppose.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech and invite the Member of Government to open the back half of this debate.
Cool. Am I audible?
Yep.
All right. Oh. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Before I get into the extension of the speech, I want to reframe what a lot of this debate looks like, because I think the majority of top half of this debate has been largely unnuanced. This isn't a this house woods debate. This house believes that, which means when you talk about the world that's most likely to happen. So I don't think the comparative that comes out in our latest POI is a completely agrarian rule study versus one giant monopoly or metropolis, but rather things that we see in the status quo. There are lots of smaller mid-sized cities that could potentially grow into a bigger city. This characterization is likely because one, people live in different geographic regions, so probably don't all move to the mega city at the start, but probably rather develop their own local regions into mid-sized cities at the beginning. Secondarily, people have their own regional identity and don't want to hedge into one national identity at the start, but probably have their own regional identities that they align with more closely because that's the people that they interact with on a more proximate basis, city states, et cetera, et cetera. The only response to this characterization comes out in the DLO when they say that, oh, there's duplication of resources, there's inefficiencies, et cetera, et cetera. That mean that this isn't that prove why their side is better. A couple of responses at this point. One, I think you're not in a position to have these resources be duplicated at the point where you started out in your own cities to begin with. If I'm in Boston versus talking about in New York, it's not duplication of resources just because we grew up in completely independent states. And for the purpose of this, they operate on autonomous zones. So just because two things exist doesn't mean that they compete with one another. There's some type of trade-off there. But the second thing to say here is that not all needs for all people are the same, right? Unless you want to have one giant tax code that solves for everyone, or one hegemonic policy that solves for everyone, I think this is a very unnuanced take because it's not able to respond to the specific needs of people, their specific wishes, probably bites back against competition too, which is inherently monopolistic and leads to all of those debates of being able to jack up prices, being able to do stuff, et cetera, et cetera. So at that point, we think having more resources is good because you're able to respond to people's preferences a lot more, able to do it on a faster time basis, and able to do so in a way that evolves to respond to people's preferences because you're able to have some level of competition within the marketplace, et cetera, et cetera. Why is this framing especially important for the round? First, I think it takes out a lot of the OO case. Why? Because the OO case is defined on all of this, all or nothing. It doesn't prove any tipping points. All they say is we need to have lower wages so we can compete on international markets, or transaction costs can be lower. But given that there's clear downsides to this risk, we care about probably worker power to some degree. We care about the degree of business autonomy. So not everything is interdependent on one another. Then I don't see why we need to go to the extreme end of concentrating resources within one giant metropolis. But the comparative is just you have 10 to 20 smaller cities within a particular region that have their own level of stuff. They're able to have it and achieve these benefits, but they don't go to the extreme extent where they have all these downsides. Cool. Two parts to this extension then. First is on the comparative. When you discourage, why do you actually get good economic growth? Filling in the holes on likelihood analysis and all that come out from OG. And I want to be clear here, right? Other than OG just asserting that immigration happens, they don't really address it. And you can't just be oh, we say this in our model, therefore fiat, therefore warrant, right? You need to actually prove likelihood analysis. So why is this likely to work? When you do not concentrate economic power within one city, you don't need to do the more extreme measures of sending everyone to Siberia. We can probably do much more palatable and much more reasonable reforms on our side of the house that solve against a lot of these problems. What does this look like? One, we think it looks like subsidies for smaller businesses. Two, opportunities for big businesses with tax cuts, et cetera. Three, development of infrastructure within other cities, et cetera. Four, microloans, et cetera, for smaller businesses to develop their industry. Why is this particularly good for economic growth on our side of the house that compares a lot to their side? One, I think most countries still want to exploit their labor forces, right? Because look, there's still other big cities that often have large populations who also want jobs. This means that there's a natural incentive to push for businesses within these areas. Crucially, the tipping point for a business choosing to move out of this main city is often going to be things like government incentives, like when you literally get a tax cut for moving to a city, likelier to move there, et cetera. But here it's also important to say that businesses still like in developing countries for cheaper costs, et cetera. It looks like developing countries still have significantly cheaper labor, which means that there's a direct incentive, but also governments still subsidize these things through tax cuts, et cetera, which makes these more profitable on the comparative, right? But the second thing why I think is particularly good is diversification, right? Because when you don't get concentration of resources, more diversification of resources happens on our side of the house. When you have 10 to 20 different cities developing their own industries, developing their own specialization, having their own unique human capital initiatives, et cetera. This is a good thing. Why? Because first, I think it means you're better able to withstand shocks in the international marketplace. And here's, I think, also where the OO case falls, right? Because OO tries to align so much with international markets and globalized markets in order to make their case work. However, they only align with these globalized markets for one particular industry, right? One particular region, because you have probably things inherent to that city, which means that you're prone to specializing within a given region, et cetera. But this means that when things like shocks happen, things when other economic downfalls happen, you're much more likely to get screwed over as a developing nation because you put all of your eggs in one particular basket. You probably have one dominant region, one dominant monopoly within a particular city, et cetera, which hampers your growth, right? The comparative is that when you have a smaller mid-sized cities, even if the net amount of growth on a per city basis is smaller, the total amount of growth and output of all these cities is better than one giant metropolis because of marginally diminishing returns at the point where you have just such an excess of demand according to then supply, et cetera, right? This apparently means that on our side of the house, we're better able to prepare for developing nations to develop into the long term because they're able to hedge their bets a lot more. They're able to be more flexible within the international marketplace, which is also probably good, right? Because that means you're better able to align with what the future is going. You're not like getting behind, getting lost, and like competing on something you're not able to compete in. Before I go on, I'll take a
This is unresponsive to everything we explained about why concentration is needed, and you cannot just claim investment is symmetric. Things like overcoming the rep of being a politically unstable country by having a well-known flourishing business district or way cheaper transaction costs between companies means that the delta of investment that we get is substantially larger, meaning that we do get more service-based investment.
So we responded to the one about how this is literally extension, right? Like transaction costs being lower means at the point that you align businesses particularly more. This means that more likely that you're able to like have price shocks or not being able to like the whole diversification stuff, which means that you're not able to respond better. On the political stuff, that's the next part of the extension here. So one, why is this worse in political power when you have concentration of economic resources? If you focus the political power within a given city, then all policies favor the one particular area. What does this look like? It looks like lots of representatives from the legislature coming in from the area without no account of including the voice of marginalized areas. It looks like pandering to dominant social groups. I reference like the Sinhalese in like downtown Colombo versus like the Thummels in the rural areas. It looks like rallies for particular campaigns happening only over these metropolitan areas, calling regions everywhere else like flyover zones, etc. Why is this super problematic? First, I think it means politicians within the area just pander to the area for tax breaks, augmentation, etc. Second, I think it hampers the growth of stable democratic regions and parties. When you have politics concentrated around a region, easier for corruption to occur because the incentives for what politicians want align a lot closer since they came from the same geographic region. I like directly like responding to the transaction cost stuff. Third, leads to decisions that pander within a particular region and don't have sustainable growth, right? I want to reference things like this. When you have things like the housing crisis, right, that lead up to 2008, when you have politicians all aligned and all try to get to people and move to these cities, then you create policies that in the short term create bubbles that create speculative risk over time. That means that people make worse decisions in the long term because you only think of one particular thing at once. Why is this not the metric directly responding to O? Because all they say that developing nations have an urban elite class that will ruin it on both sides of the house. But given that most countries here are democratic, and we're talking about the moving rural base that occurs within these countries that isn't affected by the delta in this way, and which is why you actually have a swing in this when you have different people moving between cities. Very proud.